Evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this evening's webinar. We'll just let people join there. There's numbers are rising up rapidly since I just hit the start button there. So this evening, we've organised this webinar in light of the extremely difficult circumstances that are out on farm at the minute. So I suppose a lot of people have been hoping with the last number of weeks that the weather is going to turn, and unfortunately it hasn't done so yet. So the situation is probably getting increasingly more difficult at farms level because of that. So obviously the natural inclination of people is to hope that it'll be okay the following week and maybe not make the decisions maybe that may need to have been made. And that's put people into a little more tricky position now at this stage. So we have a panel of speakers this evening, and we want to make this as interactive as possible. So we encourage people to come in with questions through the chat. Obviously, we won't be able to deal with all of them because we anticipate that there's quite a number of questions out there, but we'll try and group them together and try and answer questions that kind of are similar together if we can at all. So we won't delay in terms of getting into it. So tonight I'm joined by Donal Patton from Teagasc and Ballyhaise, a man with a wealth of experience in terms of dealing with difficult conditions, I suppose, maybe through his involvement with the heavy soils program across the country. And then we're going to be joined by James Dunne, who's also based in Ballyhaise as well. James is going to talk about the feed situation on farm. So Donal's going to talk about the grazing situation and I suppose just how people can maybe react in the short term and in the long term as well. And when I say long term, I'm talking about the next couple of weeks really, rather than anything longer than that. And then James, as I said, is going to deal with the feed situation on farms and what solutions or options might be there for people at the moment. And then later on, we're going to have Michael Egan from Teagasc and Moore Park, who's going to speak about the fertilizer regime. And obviously, there's very little fertilizer spread on a lot of farms this year to date. And we're talking about both fertilizer from a grazing point of view and also from a silage point of view, which is very ironically right around the corner effectively. And Donal, you're going to be speaking about that, I suppose, as well in terms of that move around fertilizer. So look, we'll try and deal with the current conditions today, tonight here on the call tonight, and we may have to schedule some further calls as well in order to try to maybe deal with the circumstances as they change. Again, unfortunately, a poor enough forecast ahead for the week ahead in this part of the country, in the south where I am. And I think it's pretty much common enough, Donal, probably affecting similar kind of forecast from what LED suggested there today. It looks like that there's a lot, anywhere between 1 inch and 2 inches of rain going to fall, depends over a number of days. So how do people react to that, I suppose, and what's the best angle to take for people really? So I'll hand over to you. You've only a couple of slides, Donal, that you want to...
Yeah, just a few short slides, I suppose, Stuart. So I'll just share the screen now. Look, and I suppose just first of all, maybe just to give people a bit of a flavour of the position we're in, it's probably not that much different than where most people are at. Look, and I suppose just the current situation where we're at, as I said, it's probably not that much different than where most people are, Stuart, at the minute. Struggling to get out day and night really from the start. We were out a few nights, but, predominantly it's been in at night, trying to keep out most days. There was the odd few days we didn't get out, but in the most part, staying out by day. Farm covers 640, so we're, behind where you'd like to be at this stage. For us, we'd like to have more grass on the farm, I suppose. Area grazed, we're just over the 50% grazed. And one of the problems is, I suppose, of what's left, there's a good proportion of that is the more marginal area, and that's common enough from talking to farmers that people have been pushing the poorer quality ground away all the time each week, and there's kind of there's a lot of that ground to get through in the next couple of weeks, which is going to be a challenge. Growth rates, I was just looking at the growth rates there today compared to the long-term average. We are back a little bit now. Up until last week it was normal, pretty much normal. This week now we are back a little bit, and that's probably part of that is fertilizer, or not getting the second round of fertilizer out. Production, you can see where the production's at. It's nothing to write home about. Protein's lower than what you'd like, and has dropped quite a bit in the last probably 2 weeks. Understandable enough, I'd say, just with a lot of silage going into the system. Fertilizer, we were lucky. We did get out with fertilizer in early March, but we haven't got out with anything since. And you can really see that now in terms of the start of the second round. Those paddocks, they look like they need nitrogen, but it's going to be. I don't think we're going to get it done this week, but we'll see what the forecast brings, I suppose. So that's
Donal,
the
is that
situation.
likely that the farms that have no nitrogen out are going to be slightly back again on what you said there?
Yeah, I would say so. So speaking to a lot of farmers in this part of the world, a lot of lads with no fertilizer out, no slurry out. That's I don't know the percentage off the top of my head, but like it's common. It's common. There's lots of lads in that situation. So yeah, your growth rates are going to be compromised. So look, I suppose it's just a matter of get out when you can, but the windows unfortunately are very, very short. Like really, it was early March. There was 2 or 3 days we could spread. That was pretty much it. And we haven't had dry days since. Today, some of the ground was travelable. They were spreading silage ground, grazing ground. Look, there's a lot of it that we walked today that you wouldn't travel with a fertilizer spreader. So it's going to be travel what you can when you can, I suppose. Yeah.
Yeah, just one question there in terms of the 52% graze, that's just off the milking platform and it's not the
That's
whole
just
farm?
no, it's slightly behind the target. Now, our targets, it probably sounds like a low percentage for where you are in the country, Stuart. For us, it's not that far off where we're sort of targeting. We're targeting to finish first rotation 20th of April. That's what kind of works. 15th to the 20th of April is what kind of works for us. So, yeah, we're a little bit behind, but not that far behind. We're at the cusp of going. If the weather this week had been right, we'd have been going day and night now. But we're kind of holding off just for the next few days to see how the thing pans out. We don't have, as I say, we'd like to have a bit more grass ahead of us before we go day and night. So we're just stretching what we have, I suppose, for the next 15 odd days.
Okay, so what you're going to show here now, Donal, is just responding to the situation that you're faced with, and you did a trial a couple of years ago over a 4-year period where you kind of simulated the scenarios that are going to be facing people that are on the call, both kind of the dryland type scenario maybe and the heavier delayed grazing type scenario, and then the dryland that's delayed grazing as well type scenario.
Yeah, so I suppose that's why I decided to pull it out, Stuart, when I was on this evening, because we were looking at the time, it was over a 4-year period. We were looking at, we'll say, extended grazing in our part of the world, which was, getting out in February and staying out till November, versus the average for this part of the world, which would be starting to graze in late March and finishing up on the 20th of October. So we actually, as you say, simulated that. We stuck to those dates, and it was quite interesting when we did it over the 4-year period. We actually learned some stuff about how to manage situations like this, where, for some people just genuinely couldn't get out or wouldn't have got a big area grazed over the last number of weeks. They're probably faced with the similar challenges what we had with our late turnout group. So can you see that slide there?
Yeah, I can, yeah.
Yeah, so I suppose look at it, a 4-year trial. Obviously, we were looking at the effects that housed for longer periods had on cow performance, and it's everybody's seeing it this year. We're seeing it ourselves. Protein percentage is reduced, yield is reduced, and the amount of feed you have to put in to get anywhere close is increasing. So it's all bad news on that front, I suppose, and we kind of know that, and that's why there has been such a drive to get people out when they can to utilize grass. It reduces our costs, it increases our performance, and it's really in years like this where some guys can't get out that you really see the value of grass. So I suppose one of the challenges for the late turnout treatments, and similar to where a lot of farmers are going to face this year, is that your farm cover is going to be high because it's continuing to grow. Like growth, as I said, up until this week was normal enough. So cover was building, there was no demand as such, and that's a challenge. Like that's a big challenge because obviously pre-grazing yields are getting higher, and it's, I suppose, how we manage that going into the second rotation on those farms. So very much so that's happened at this stage, Stuart. It's about how we transition into second rotation on those farms. It's going to be the really interesting thing, or the thing that people are going to have to maybe do things that they're not used to doing to get a good result. So if you just follow, I suppose, the two lines here, this is the average farm cover across those different two different treatments right across the year. So starting here, this is the middle here, this is sort of the autumn time, and this is the average over the 4-year period. So the red line is sort of what we would be normally doing or recommending to do, trying to extend our grass in the back end, building up a high peak cover, finishing grazing sometime in mid-November. You know, grass gets a chance to build back up again. Then we go out with cows, we graze when we can, and we end up finishing first rotation somewhere in the middle of April. So that's kind of what we've been doing for a long number of years, what we'd be recommending people to do. The green line is what the average farmer in this part of the world actually does. So that's, you know, they don't build up grass in the autumn time. They generally finish sort of late October, finish grazing probably a week or two earlier than what we would. And then turnout would definitely be slower. So on into, you know, late March, it's basically 200 days grazing, full days. So it's mid-March, it's turnout date by day, and 1st of April by day and night. So that's pretty much what we did. And, you know, even by not, you know, we tried not to build cover in autumn, but even, you know, you stop grazing in 20th of October, you still build up quite a lot of grass. So we actually opened or started grazing on those treatments at 1,200 of a farm cover, which was quite a challenge, because very similar to what people are facing at the minute. A lot of the farm with big covers on it, and you know how we get around that. So the one thing I want to sort of show from this is that the way we managed it, okay, there was huge differences in autumn and spring, but through the mid portion of the year, basically through management decisions we took mainly in April, sort of April, early May, we got the thing back on track pretty well, and that transpired into high performance. And it also transpired into grass quality. So we actually corrected the grass quality by the decisions we made in April and early May. So I thought maybe just what I do is step back sort of 5th of April 2020, so similar time of year as we're at now, and look at the two different treatments, because it kind of simulates what, you know, as you said, there's different people in different situations. So this is kind of the recommended, or what we were aiming to do with an early turnout. So we had sort of, at this stage of the year, we had sort of 700 back on our first paddocks we grazed in February, which is not that much different at the minute. We had 30% of our first round left, which is, you know, we're a bit behind that this year actually. But the aim of the game was, when we get sort of 1,100-1,200 on 2 or 3 paddocks, that we'd skip into the second round. And as I said already, that sort of, generally speaking, happens somewhere around the 15th to the 20th of April for us. Probably earlier than that for people on drier land than we're on, or further south. So, you know, if you're in that situation, you're in a good enough situation, you're just going to have to stretch out the remainder of your first round for as long as you think you need to get that sort of level of cover back on the start of the second rotation. The probably more common situation, well, I know in this part of the world, I don't know what story down south, but this would be more common, speaking to farmers, where, you know, and this is our late turnout group as we sort of ran it over those 4 years. So same date, 5th of April 2020, we were only starting to graze from the 20th of March. We only had 200 back on our first paddocks grazed, which you can kind of see here. So, because they weren't that long grazed, obviously. And we are only at about 20% of our area got through at this stage. So what are the things that we did to try and get over the, you know, get the thing back into shape, get over the problem? So the first thing we did over the 4 years, we didn't start on those treatments at the top of the wedge. We inverted the wedge. We basically started as close to the bottom as we possibly could. If we were in at night, which we were for the first week, out by day, and at night we grazed light 800 covers. Then once we go full time, we were in the sort of 1,100-1,200 covers. And generally speaking, over the period, I was looking back at the dates today, it was around about the 25th of April when we finished first rotation on those treatments. And we ended up skipping in and around 25-30% of the area and baled that early. So again, late April, early May, we went in, took that out, and I think that was the big thing that helped to correct the situation. So look at the things that people have to do. Try and get at least one grazing in per day if you can at all. If it's for a few hours after milking or whatever you can do, try and do that as many days of the week as you possibly can. Regular measurement to decide when to start the second round, so knowing what is on the start of your second round and making that decision when to skip in. And I suppose the last thing there, which is a common enough one I see, where people will make the right call, they'll skip the paddock, but then oftentimes they say, well, I'll be cutting pit silage in 2 weeks, I'll leave it sit for the pit, and they generally run themselves into a hole. So when you identify the surplus, take it out early and correct the situation and get back on track as quick as you possibly can.
So Donal, people will be wondering why you're talking about correcting the second round now, we'll say, and trying to get that right. What should people be doing right now in terms of trying to get going? What's your advice from your experience?
Yeah, the get going thing, I suppose what has been a real challenge this spring, Stuart, is that there wasn't, generally you get wet days or wet periods and then you get dry periods. And the dry periods are when people get going. And we just haven't had that. We've had just constant wet days throughout February, with a few dry days at the start of March when we got fertilizer out, and then it basically hasn't stopped raining since. So I think you just have to start. You just have to start. Now, obviously, I know there's probably a good number of people on this call, and they're of all varying different soil types and all the rest of it. But within most farms, there's some area where you have a chance. So go there, start. Don't overreact to the first day or two. I often see that where people put cows out. Cows will make a bit of a mess for the first day or two, and they panic and they come back in, and they just end up having to do that again in 2 weeks. So it's actually, you just have to stick with it. Limited time. So if you feel you're doing there is a point where you just can't go out. I understand that. That happens and has happened a lot this spring. But for most part, if you limit the time the cows are on the paddock, it's amazing what you can get away with. So you just have to get going, Stuart. You have to pick a place that you have a chance. Go out, look at it, and just get going if you haven't started already.
And Donal, is it a case of like people are busy, like all the extra feeding creates extra work, but is it a case of get the cows milked in the morning, maybe feed the calves and try to find the dry spot if the day is good?
Yeah, well, oftentimes, I'm not a fan of holding cows back after milking because it kind of elongates labour and all the rest of it. But in saying all that, in weather like this, sometimes you have to do that just to, if you're milking and feeding calves is absolutely bucket and rain, let the cows stand for half an hour or an hour or whatever, and then go and see where you're at. Because when you make the decision to turn them in, that's it for the day. You're not going to let them out then after that. So, that's been happening a lot this spring. So it's just one of them things. You'll find the lads who are used to grazing in February and March kind of know all this stuff. There's other lads who don't usually turn out till mid-March or whatever, and the conditions now are probably as challenging as there would be in lots of years in February. So just knowing you're just going to have to get out, have a look and walk. And at this time of year, it's amazing how quick things change. Like even today we walked around, I couldn't believe how good conditions was on the better parts of the farm. On the wetter parts of the farm, it's, you may say, impassable, but you just have to aim and go where you can.
Yeah, I think I overheard people in the office today speaking to one another, and had to put out a bit of slurry yesterday. Obviously because pressure was on to get that out. And the comment was the difference between the first load and the last load 2 hours later was quite significant in terms of ground conditions. So the conditions, like you said, they're making the decision to turn them in or keep them in for the day is very finite or very final as in once they're in, like, whereas the opportunities do tend to come, like since the clock has gone forward, obviously Saturday night there, the day length is increasing. The opportunities are coming to just pick it off, I suppose, is what we're really talking about. Like, people are under pressure now for fodder stocks, and every day will count in terms of days not eating silage when you're tight on silage, especially with the forecast poor for the next 7 or 10 days potentially still. But the positive side is that once it does turn, it can turn very quickly, even on the heavy ground, which is still going to take time to dry out. But not every farm. It's important that people realise that there's very few farms in the country that are completely heavy soil. Like, there's mixed soil across the vast majority of farms.
Yeah, and you can pick your point. And I suppose the other thing too is, look, in conditions like this, there'll be lads sending me pictures and videos, and I'm not happy with the graze. Just forget about that. Just get them out and get moving. Like, it's not going to be perfect or anywhere near perfect, but it's still better to have made an attempt to get some grass into the cow's diet than to be sitting back waiting for perfection, because it's just not going to come in a year like this. You just have to go when you can.
Yeah, okay. So just a comment in there from a person that said it was quite clear where there was nitrogen out and not nitrogen out in terms of the growth rates from what they've seen in the last couple of days as well. So higher growth rates with nitrogen out. Look, I think that's, again, you have to take that with the sentiment is correct behind it, but in reality, if it hasn't been possible to travel, like you said there, you've got 2 or 3 days of an opportunity, and some people have managed to pick that off, and some haven't. And I suppose, look, we'll be talking later on with Mike Egan in terms of the actual fertilizer advice now, depending on the situation that people find themselves in. So, any further comments, I suppose, Donal, in terms of the feed budget within Ballyhaise? Have you done anything different in relation to kind of the feed stock that you've been using in the spring that is 2024 so far?
No, so far we haven't, as in it's been meal in the parlour, silage in the shed, grass in the paddock. Silage reserves are getting tight, like. So whether we have to I suppose we'll have to make that call in the next week or 10 days. If the thing isn't starting to improve at that stage, we may have to introduce a third feed or try and, start stretching things a little bit. But for the time being, we're continuing as is, silage, meal and grass. We haven't really been in it. And it was rare enough. I think there was maybe 3 or 4 days they were in full time for 3 or 4 days, or there was a weekend of snow back in early March. So, I suppose the fact you're getting the one bout of grazing in most days, it means you don't have to be, well, in my head, you don't have to be thinking about other feeds other than, meal and silage.
Okay. Just a quick question in there, and it's a good one actually, because I think it's a big concern for a lot of people is that, okay, in some cases where we are tight, but at the same time, like we were saying earlier, maybe that because of average growth, and maybe if you had got some bit of grazing done in February, that there might be close enough to kind of getting started cover on your first paddock of your second rotation. What's the concern, I think, is that we've always said that if you do damage in the first round, it's okay, but if you hit it again in the second rotation, that you're going to hamper production for the year effectively. So what's the approach there, or what's your thinking in
Look,
terms of
those paddocks are tender. I suppose what we've always done over the years is just mix and match, Stuart, a little bit between first and second rotation. So don't fully finish your first rotation and end up in a situation where you have no choice but to go to the next 3 or 4 paddocks. So mixing and matching definitely helps. But I can see that, I suppose, we're no different. Like, we're in the situation now where, as I said, of what we have left, there's at least half of what we have left, and maybe more, that is, it's not passable today. Like, it's not grazable today. It's not, you definitely couldn't drive a machine on it today. So I suppose that's why we're not just rushing out at night yet until we see what, because I could have 50% grazed or I could really have 70% grazed. We're not quite sure yet, depending on what happens. So it's just a matter, I suppose, don't put yourself in the position where you have no choice but to go into those in wet weather. If you can at all, avoid it. So even though it's not palatable now to that there's silage still going into the diet, I think it's better to do that till we, for the next week or so, till we see what way things pans out. And on paper, we probably could get away with going full-time grazing now, but that's one of the reasons why we're a bit hesitant, that we don't want to be running into the start of the second rotation when it's wet, like.
So you're just keeping a bit in reserve effectively.
Keeping a bit in reserve and then having the capacity to mix and match when that crossover comes. But as I said, for us, that's at least 12 to 15 days away yet, even on the normal, yeah.
Okay, so there's actually a lot of questions in relation to that there now, Donald. So continuing to on off graze is one of the questions there. I think that's a must in tricky conditions, I think, isn't it?
Yeah, look we were getting away actually. We're getting away with the fact we were in at night quite a lot. We were getting away with, out by day, most days, the full days, but sometimes the lads would have to put them in early. But if you're in a situation where you've got a lot of grass out there, as in you've very little grazing done yet, you've a lot of grass out there, and you have to start somewhere and getting through area. It's back to what I said a few minutes ago, like limiting the time the cows is on the paddock. It's amazing it's amazing what you can get away with, like. So if need be, if you have to do that to limit the damage, you have to do it. Just be careful and keep a close eye on cow condition, because when you're doing it for long periods of time, like we'd often be doing that for a month or 6 weeks at a time, you can get it wrong too, and you can affect body condition, which whatever about doing that in February and March, doing it in April is a big problem. So
yeah, it's the
mind
intake capacity.
mind the cow is the most important thing. If the graze out's not perfect, we'll worry about that again. If we do a wee bit of poaching, we'll worry about that again. But mind the cow, like, particularly for the next month.
Yeah, and that's answering the last question that's come in there so far. Anyway, in terms of the approach to grazing high covers, if you damage them, is it worse than damaging low covers? It's
Well, I look at it. We have a lot of experience in that, because our overwinter growth, is low. So we've always carried quite a bit of grass over winter. Now clover is changing that whole story. That's another day's crack. But we have a lot of experience in that, Stuart. I've found, like, at the minute, we've been grazing some paddocks up on 2000. It's not a problem yet, like, because even though there's a big cover of grass, the stem hasn't started to rise yet in it. You can do a decent job. You're not going to graze it out real tight, but you'll do a decent job on it. And actually, in some of these wet conditions, we tend to find we'll get away, depending on what type of land it's on, we get away okay on those. Like, so I don't see that as a big issue. And we're doing it, as I say, we're housed at night at times and grazing that sort of stuff by day and getting away okay. Like, it's not perfect, but it's okay. Like.
Yeah, so I think there's one other question again relating to the same thing. Like, should you house cows rather than poach land for a second time? But your advice is to dive in, get out again quick, and go back to the shed at that point. But have your
it depends on the situation you're in, Stuart. Look, if you're in the situation where you've nothing done, you need to get moving. You need to get moving. If you're in the situation we are, where you're at 50-60% grazed, I'm just hedging my bets now for the next week, pushing it down the road a little bit. I can't see that it's going to get out of control on us at the farm cover we're at. So that's sort of our approach. We're just pushing it down the road a little bit to see what happens. But you don't want to be in the position where it could happen. Like, I've seen it happening before, but we don't want to get into the position where our only option is to house completely for a week, like, or for 3 or 4 days. So I would prefer to keep feeding some silage now, that there's still grass, grass can into the diet right through. But it'll just depend. Like, really, it has 10 days to 2 weeks for weather to sort itself. If it doesn't, we'll have to be thinking about that in 2 weeks' time. I'm sure we don't know yet what way that's going to go, but I'd try and avoid that if we could. Like,
Yeah, so the situation is very dynamic, and obviously the management around it has to be dynamic then as a result of that. Like, so there's a few questions beginning to come there now, Donal, in relation to feed options and stuff like that there. So I think we might just switch over to James there.
yeah,
Obviously, you're still there in the background if people want to ask questions, and the people that are asking questions in relation to fertilizer there at the minute as well. I'm just holding them back from the point of view that we have Mike Egan there now in a second to deal with the fertilizer question. So we'll go to Mike when that comes up. So James, you've just one or two slides again in relation to, so one of the questions there is actually come about the whole issue around peak yield for the cow. So obviously we're really beginning to move into the lactation now. We're at week 8 for the earliest calves cows, week 9, week 10 even. So we're beginning to head towards peak yield, and the concern is there a risk that we're going to hamper the actual performance of the cow for the year as a result of that? So what you got to say to us, so James?
Yeah, ultimately. So we'll run through in terms of Stuart. Thanks a million. And I suppose the big challenge here is in terms of exactly that. We're heading into April. We're getting closer to that start of breeding date. We're getting closer to peak production. And really the challenge is, how do we best feed the cow, feed the herd in the current situation? I suppose maybe before we get into the facts and figures here, there's a range of scenarios out there which Donal has alluded to. So what I would say is, for our listeners and for our viewers, I should say, in terms of assess their own farm situation in terms of on an individual case-by-case basis, Stuart. And by that, what do I mean? In terms of there's different soil types, ground conditions are going to be different on farms, but really to follow up on what Donal's saying there, in terms of, firstly, there's no substitute for grazed grass, which we're going to actually see. But secondly, in terms of this idea, we've been waiting in a lot of cases up till this point. The point has come where we need to get grazed grass into cows where at all possible. I understand there's challenges around that, but what I would say is, as you said earlier in the call, ultimately those ground conditions are changing. We get a good day, or we get a couple of good days. It's unbelievable what you can do. The other point on that is assessing that ultimately cows don't need to be out. If we can get 2, 3, 4 hours grazing, we can get 6, 7 kilos of grass into the diet, and we'll show the impact of that in a moment. The other thing is, what I would say, and it's different on farms, just looking at PBI reports there recently, is grass availability. It's obviously not of concern for the farms that haven't a lot of grazing done, but ultimately those farms, as Donal alluded to, in terms of farms that are maybe on target, they'd normally be okay, but maybe regrowths are that little bit slower than they'd like. Possibly in that situation, just assess do a cover, assess where you're at. Do we need to slow cows up slightly there? As I say, that's not an issue where there's plenty of grass on the farm. The final point, and one, you mentioned it in terms of grass silage and where are stocks at. Ultimately, stocks are running low on a lot of farms. In some cases, they've run out and silage is being purchased. We need to know at an individual farm level, ultimately, where we're at with that regard. I would mention quality, but the reality is, at this stage, Stuart, there's not a lot of quality silage left on farms. It's kind of feed what you have or buy what you can get as such. So that probably emphasizes the point that we need to get grazing even more. So look, in terms of what we've done here is we've 4 main scenarios really that I'm sure our viewers will fall into some of those categories along the way. But ultimately, if we look at the first scenario there, it's probably the most common one over the last few weeks in terms of cows housed, or definitely housed for periods, prolonged periods, fed. We have a 70 DMD silage in here. The reality is there's probably a lot of cows maybe not on that now at this point, Stuart. It mightn't even be that quality, and feeding 5 kilos of ration. What's happening in that situation? Look, at intakes are compromised due to forage quality. And as a result, the energy density and the protein density of that diet is lower than we'd like. I suppose when we look at what that diet actually supports, then you're looking something in the region of 21 kilos of milk, and not a lot along probably with 3.1 protein, which when we look at group reports at the moment, it's not uncommon to what's actually happening out there. So in terms of then, I suppose, what are the options? And I'll maybe skip forward to ultimately what Donal was saying there. We kind of need to get going. So we've held the feeding rate at the same 5 kilos, but what we have done here in this scenario is we've offered the cows 3 to 4 hours grazing. We get our 6 to 7 kilos of grass dry matter in that period. So when we actually look at what this has done, it has obviously increased the total dry matter intake to the tune of about 1.5 kilos, which subsequently has increased that energy and protein density of the diet. That's going to support ultimately going to support an extra 3 kilos of milk and get protein back on track, something in the tune of kind of 3.46. That comes with all the challenges around grazing, on-off grazing, ground conditions. I'm not saying that's straightforward, Stuart, but we're at a situation now where we need to be looking for these dry spots at the farms. That may be 3 or 4 days grazing in the week. There may be a couple of days where we won't actually get that in. And I think ultimately, and Donal maybe might comment on this before we go, we probably are going to do a certain amount of damage, which is repairable, and we probably need to understand that. Don't be waiting for that week or 10 days dry weather, as you said, because it doesn't look like it's actually coming. Obviously, then when conditions improve, we can transition on to grass full time when we do that. The thing is obviously on the mend, so I'm not going to dwell too long on that.
But James, your big point is to try to, like, why are we're probably winding people up now talking about grazing here, like, potentially, but there's a reason why we're talking about trying to pick off the opportunities when they come, because that indoor diet is absolutely stripping cows of condition.
100%, and ultimately what we're going to run into issues in terms of animal performance, body condition score loss, and we're heading towards that breeding start date, so we'll have reproductive issues off the back of all of that as well. When people talk about pig production, and I think that's important, like the things that will really hammer pig production, and all the research would have shown that before, is cows in poor body condition. We need to protect that body condition, and I'm going to come back to that where we maybe can't get out, but we need to mind the cow, and I think that's the important point. Number one rule in all this: make sure the cow is fed to the best of her ability every day, I think, and if we keep that in mind, it's probably the bit we need in terms of to get out grazing where we can. And I'm conscious of that, Stuart. I understand that there's some farms where that's just not possible at the moment, so I am conscious of that, not to be annoying people in what has been a very difficult couple of months. For those farms that I have mentioned, in terms of where it just ground conditions don't allow grazing maybe in the short term, if we look at the indoors full-time bee diet that you can see there, the second scenario, I suppose, how can we better in terms of what the current situation is on farms? And it's the same silage we have, but what we are looking at doing there is we need to increase concentrate feeding levels up to that kind of 8 or 8.5 kilos. How are we going to do that? Something in the region of 6 to 6.5 kilos, Stuart, of concentrate fed through the parlour. Because forage levels and silage quality is poor, we have to be careful in terms of the overall diet fibre intakes. So what we'd be suggesting there is, can we go in with something in a midday feed, a soya hulls, a beet pulp, a high fibres, high energy source of concentrate, and go in there with a couple of kilos, 2 or 2.5 kilos. You can see ultimately what that's delivering there. We're getting intakes up to something over 17 kilos, milk kilos supported then at 24, and protein recovering somewhat, albeit. The point I will make is when you look across those scenarios, there is no substitute for grazed grass, so we do have to do our best to get that in as soon as possible. Look, as I said, we'll come to it maybe in the next slide. I think we need to avoid complicating feeding solutions. Labour's an issue on farm. There's a lot of work with on-off grazing. Everybody acknowledges that you're doing cubicles twice when normally cows would be out maybe full time at this stage. We don't want to complicate and add labour into the system that's already possibly under pressure. And that's where we're talking about the likes of those dry feeds. they're often very easy to put in and very easy to take out, Stuart. So that may be an option. That may be an option for some people in the short term.
I suppose, James, the other thing is that like what we're trying to acknowledge that, like Donal and I have said it there already, that ground conditions change. There's a point being made there that we need to be realistic in what we're saying, because we're saying, oh, get out, but people are saying we've grazed the dry ground now and we've nothing left but the wet ground. Well, like, we are accepting that, but if you're going to be stuck inside, and if the wet ground is so limiting that you cannot get out to graze, then you have to be on the kind of the figures that you're showing there in diet B, will say, or you have to go up to the 8 or 9 kilos, and that requires going with your midday feed type scenario in order to avoid acidosis issues and so forth that could come from high feeding levels in the parlour, and I suppose just spreading it out. So we don't have our heads buried in the sand. We know the conditions that are out there, but what we are saying is that there are opportunities presenting themselves to graze on occasion, and people need to take those opportunities when they come, and when they don't. Donal said it as well there. There are days when you just can't graze, and when you can't graze, you have to go and feed the living daylights out of them to make sure that they are well fed, and that has to be the objective, to keep them well fed. Like,
I think the important point there, Stuart, is don't find yourself in the red zone. And by ultimately, what I'm saying there in the red zone is that average to poor quality silage and 4 or 5 kilos a meal isn't adequate. Cows are going to lose a significant amount of condition. They're not going to perform, and we're going to head into the breeding season in a poor place. So, sorry, Stuart.
Yeah, just before you go on, there's a good question actually relating to the condition score as well. Like, should you be on a higher protein nut inside now if you're going to be held inside effectively? So there's two ways of looking at it, I suppose, James, isn't there? Like, I mean, how long are you going to be inside? God only knows at the moment, unfortunately. But maybe you might be out tomorrow. So, like, you could have 10 ton of 18% protein inside in the bin and be at grass in a week's time, and
that's the point. And in a lot of cases, Stuart, ultimately energy is the limiting factor, probably 9 times out of 10. So we add all this additional protein in, but there isn't actually enough energy in the diet maybe to utilize that protein. So what I would say there, I wouldn't be too concerned in terms of the short term. If we were in Johnstown Castle, for example, and looking at an autumn calf cow, of course you'd be feeding an 18% crude protein nut, because you're settling her down on a diet for an 8, 10, 12-week period there. But in the current situation, I wouldn't be too concerned in terms of the 16% short, because I'd be looking in terms of, can we actually get back out and get a bit of grass in the diet? And that could actually do more harm when we start getting grass in the diet in terms of stripping condition of those cows further. If there's farms where they feel they're going to be in for a prolonged period, it ultimately won't do any harm to put in the 18. But I would err on the side that we're going to get grass in the diet and stick to the 16.
Yeah.
Just one other question, and this is the only other slide I have, Stuart, and something that's cropping up and always does, is feed and what's available, what's good value. So what I did this morning was, in terms of, I ran the Teagasc relative feed value calculator based on rolled barley at 285 a ton and soya at 495 a ton, just to get the relative feed values of a few of the options that's there. What I would say is anybody can Google that calculator, plug in the figures, and there's a range of concentrates, wet feeds, forages there where you can actually look at what value is put on them based on the two figures I've said. What I would say with regards that, I suppose, is when we're assessing those things, there's a number of things we need to take into consideration. Firstly, we should assess them on a dry matter basis. Some of these wet feeds look like value, Stuart, and all of a sudden, when you see then they're down at 19 or 20% dry matter, you also have to take into account the variability. They're maybe not as good as value as we think. The other point is, and we mentioned them already, in terms of that additional labour that's associated with feeding out. Is there ways, and as I said it earlier, dry feeds are usually easier. You can start feeding, you can stop feeding. It allows you, where you're maybe getting the grass for periods of the week, to put it in, to take it out. And ultimately the genetics we have are capable of managing with that. The final point then is in terms of wet feeds and forages. You can see some of the figures there. We'll look at them in a moment. They need to be discounted to allow for losses, and that can be in the region of 10%. So that's going to lower the value in terms of the actual relative value of those as well. The only other point I'd make on some of those things is they usually come in full loads, and depending on herd size, you could end up pushing yourself into a corner where you end up feeding stuff that you don't actually require if the weather does mend.
Okay, James, just in the interest of time, we'll keep moving, but couple of questions coming in about palm kernel there.
Yep.
Have a value on that, I think, as well.
Yeah, 100%. So if you look at your beet pulps, your soya hulls, your palm kernel falls into a similar category. Not as good in terms of the energy density, but very high fiber source as well. You're probably looking something in the region of kind of 260 in that ballpark, something in the region of 20 quid behind your hulls and beet pulp. What I would say is on those dry feeds, just getting a price this morning, hulls are probably trading 25 to 30 euros a ton cheaper, Stuart. And you can see in terms of the relative feed value there, they're very, very similar in terms of beet pulp. Maybe not just as good in terms of the energy source, but at 30 quid a ton cheaper than beet pulp, that's probably the route you'd be going.
Okay, and just last question, and we'll switch to Mike then on the fertilizer, and we'll have you back at the end. Midday feed, if you're in and out, and you're only in full time the odd day, is it justified, or what's your thinking on that?
The reality is, if you're getting to grass most days, you're probably not going to complicate it. You'll possibly push to that 6 kilo mark, Stuart, through the parlour, and get grass in as many days as possible. It's more for periods maybe where forage is getting a little bit short and ground conditions are really, really difficult, where we don't think we're gonna get grass in the diet on a day-to-day basis.
And the last one for you then, James, will say you've highlighted a 68 and a 72 DMD down there at the bottom of the table. The likelihood is that that's not what people are consuming now at this stage, because we're at the back of the larder now at this stage. So once a day?
Yeah, if it's the reality is in terms of once a day milking, is it?
Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, the reality is once a day milking, there's no added benefit if you don't give them the same feed, Stuart. And I think that idea, and we've seen that with some of the thin cows leading up to breeding, and we do it, and all of a sudden you hear they're only getting half the meal they were getting. There's no benefit. So what I would say there is, we need to feed the herd, cutting to once a day, thinking that we're going to save on feed. We're end up going to take condition off cows and lose a lot of performance at this time of year.
Okay, James, as I said, we'll have you back there towards the end. So we'll just switch over to the fertilizer. So Mike Egan has joined us to deal with the fertilizer questions, and huge variability, I suppose, Mike, from the point of view of the various situations that are on farm. Farmers have some fertilizer spread. I know that in Moore Park, the second round has been applied. We'll say the first round was later than normal, but it was out. But there are farms that have nothing at all spread. So the situation, I suppose, in terms of being able to deal with that now on farms, to make the right decisions around what to go with now and how much to go with. And obviously we have to be conscious of what's available in terms of allowances now as well, having been limited again further in the regulation changes this year. So and just I'll have to, James, can you make Michael a co-host there in order to share, please?
Yeah, look, I'll just start away when James is waiting. So yeah, look, I think there's a couple of different scenarios at the moment that's out there. I think we need to be very careful of that in it. In terms of where we are at the moment in relation to weather conditions, I think we need to be very careful on what we want in terms of, sorry, I'm just trying to get to share this now. Scenarios, and there's probably very few that's in this, and I've tried to do the similar to what James and Donal did in terms of different scenarios. And I'm very aware of the weather conditions that's there for the past couple of weeks and months, and this week and the next couple of days as well. So look, there probably are some farms that are currently up to date and they have their probably 70 to 80 kilos of nitrogen out. And for anyone that's in that situation, they're probably continuing to graze as well and go through what Donal and James are talking about. And for anyone that is in that situation, I think it's to continue now to follow with fertilizer after grazing in the region of 15 to 20 kilos per grazing rotation or every 20, 25 days. So I think that's one, and there's probably not very many in that. There's probably a lot of people that fall into this category at the moment, and I'm just going to go through these and then we'll go through them scenarios. But the couple of dry weeks, a couple of dry days in the second half of March, they probably went with half a bag or a little over half a bag. Don't worry about the rates here, they're going to vary. I think anyone that's in that situation that has one round of fertilizer out at some stage in March, allow 4 to 5 weeks between the two applications, and then go again with another 30, 35 kilos, if that's all you have out, to try and get up to target, and then go back to a scenario of following the cows thereafter. So depending when it went out in March, try and leave a window of 4 to 5 weeks before your second application, and depending on. So ideally, if it was the 15th of March, target the 15th of April then for your second round. People that just got Surrey out early on in the year at the end of January when it was reasonably dry and have got nothing out in terms of chemical fertilizer or very little grazing done to date either, blanket spread everything as soon as conditions allow, with somewhere in the region of a bag of urea or a little under, depending on the cover of grass that you have and how much slurry and when the slurry went out in February. But again, blanket spread everything. And what I mean by conditions, and Donal has highlighted already, and a lot of questions have come in that there's some dry ground and some wet ground, and some of the dry ground is grazed. Obviously, don't go spreading fertilizer on some of the heavy ground that's waterlogged, and that don't allow those conditions to be to travel. So again, when we're talking about conditions, it is soil temperatures, which is not much of an issue at the moment. So we want them 6 degrees rising and above. We don't want fields waterlogged at the time of spreading. So again, anything's waterlogged, you can't graze them. You shouldn't be driving on them either. And try and avoid spreading fertilizer within a 24 to 48 window of heavy rainfall coming after it. So if there is heavy rainfall promised tomorrow and it's dry today, don't spread fertilizer today. And the last one, then, there's nothing out, there's no fertilizer, there is no slurry out, there is nothing at all out. Blanket spread again, a bag urea, again, 40 plus kilos of nitrogen, again, as soon as conditions allow. And if there is no slurry out, apply your slurry after grazing. Prioritize chemical nitrogen over the slurry at this stage, just because of trafficability issues, unless it's a pipe that's gone out. And then apply 2,000 gallons after grazing as well. Now, there is a case that if weather improves and we can go with fertilizer, should we spread everything directly in front of the cows? I would argue that we should, at this stage, if you're in a situation that you have nothing out. So try and spread everything at this stage, unless the cows are currently in it. I think we need to be in a situation now that we need to get grass growing. It has been reasonably good at the moment, but with very little grazing done, regrowths are really going to be hit. And by not allowing those paddocks to be spread now, it is going to delay them. So spread everything as soon as conditions allow. And finding that has no slurry out or no fertilizer, goes on parts of your farm or when it allows, and you try and hit that criteria that's not waterlogged and there's no heavy rain forecast in the following 24 to 36 hours, that then go slurry thereafter. There's probably...
So you're actually just going to come to it there now with the pea fertilizer, but just a question of 95% of the platform grazed, should you go with 2 bags of 18-6-12? And advisors across the country are now shaking with the thought that there's 18-6-12 going to be recommended for across the board potentially. So what's your recommendation there?
I'm not advisor, so I don't have to deal with that. No, but look, I think we need to be very careful of the pea allowances, and you mentioned at the start with the new, and particularly the fertilizer register as well. Yeah. Look, there is pea and slurry as well, and I think we should try and utilize much of that. If you have a pea allowance and going with it, and particularly on ground that was damaged, on any ground that has been grazed, that has been damaged, Donal covered already, we don't want to damage those again, because that is going to, within reason, obviously, and conditions are going to really dictate that, but we don't want to damage them again, because that's going to cause a lot of compaction damage. So try and graze them reasonable, but don't go near them with a roller. But we try to need to get them to tiller out again. And if there is a pea allowance, it should probably target it towards those paddocks. And if you have allowance to go with pea, whatever it is, try and hit it on those paddocks that are damaged and potentially lower indexes as well, because it'll allow that, it'll encourage tillering to try and fill up that space again. We don't leave these very open paddocks that are not going to fill out or tiller out again, and they're going to be ingressed with weeds after the wet weather. So I think if you have a P allowance, go at it. If you don't, try and target some of the slurry or parlour washings, wet and ground more so, but dirty water or parlour washings or slurry, watery slurry at a rate of about 2,000 gallons. On average slurry, that's somewhere in the region of 8 to 10 units of P that you'll get out with 2,000 gallons of reasonable quality slurry. So try and get that out. And if you have a P allowance, again, targeted fertilizer, drier ground that you can travel on, that is trafficable, that is not waterlogged, aim for those paddocks. You don't need to spread everything, go little and often. And if you have nothing out, blanket spread. Don't be waiting to follow the cows. If you have nothing done and you're getting back to, whenever it dries up and you're getting back to grazing, don't be waiting until after it's grazed to go blanket spread before. Get it into the ground, get it into the plant. As soon as it's grazed, you're going to increase regrowth rates substantially by blanket spreading as soon as conditions allow, rather than waiting until after it's grazed. You'll have a delay about 5 to 10 days. The question that happens every year, and particularly this year, importance of fertilizer on ungrazed heavy covers, extremely important. And if we don't, I've seen a lot of questions are in a discussion that it's very hard to graze these heavy covers now. There's going to be a heavy butt left in the base of them. That is going to reduce growth rates. By not spreading those, it is going to even reduce growth rates more so. So it is still as important as every other year to spread fertilizer on ground that is heavy. Heavy covers, what I mean now, not heavy land, heavy covers, and to increase regrowth. And I'm completely aware with the conditions, heavy covers, trafficability, this all has to be done in a situation that we can still trafficability and that we meet that criteria in terms of waterlogged soil. It's not waterlogged, soil fertility, soil temperature, and then heavy rainfall afterwards. And a lot of fertilizer, talking to any of the fertilizer reps, there's very little fertilizer sold or moving. If you have not got fertilizer bought, try and put in an order for it straight away, because there's going to be huge delays if weather takes up with tillage sector and the dairy sector, trying to get fertilizer in yard with restrictions in terms of lorry haulage and feed mills being extremely busy. If you have not got your fertilizer, and I think only a quarter of the fertilizer that would typically sold up until April, only a quarter of it has been sold this year so far in terms of relative value. So try and get fertilizer ordered and into the yard. If it's not in the yard and conditions improved, it's going to be very difficult to get it out. And if you are only ordering your fertilizer now and you have nothing in the yard, try and get sulfur included in that fertilizer that's coming in now. If you have it already there, don't go waiting to change it to spread what you have. If you're just ordering it now, try and get sulfur out. So that's it. I'll go through the next slide then. It's just one slide in on silage as well. And then if there's any questions, Stuart.
Yeah, no, there's questions coming in about silage anyway, Mike, so I might as well proceed and we can come back to them then.
Yeah. Look, I'm not going to go through this. And I think we need to be conscious that fertilizer needs to go out now, but it also needs to go out for the rest of the year as well. You mentioned already with the new allowances. So this is the new fertilizer strategy table. I'm not going to include it. So again, if we look at this first line here, grass only swards, this is where it should be. Up until beginning or end of early April, where we are now, we're talking 76 kilos of nitrogen out if everything was on target. That's not the case now. We need to go through what we've just talked about and then follow this application strategy to try and maintain within that new limits of 212. And then again, depending on if there's clover in the swards, try and achieve these targets depending on the clover that's in it. I'm not going to go through that in much detail. In terms of silage ground, I think there's a lot of empty silage beds there. We need to get a good yield of silage back into the yard, build reserves, and building into what Donal was talking about. A lot of people that have very little grazing done, and some of that is going to have to go into silage too. Some is going to be longer term silage that can be closed up with your first cut and put into the pit in May, and some is going to have to be taken relatively soon in terms of surpluses to get it back into the grazing rotation as well. But in terms of fertilizer for longer term or first cut silage ground, I think if we look at this response yield to different application rates of fertilizer, and I think this is a year particularly that we need to get an increased yield and a high nitrogen response to it. So in that, we're talking somewhere between 80 and 100 kilos of chemical nitrogen to grow our first ton crop. And it's going to be somewhere within that ball of 80. And again, if the slurry going out, depending on the cover that's on it, you're making up that balance with slurry. So a typical 2,500 gallons of slurry is going to have somewhere in the region of 15 to 20 kilos of nitrogen. So you're taking that off the total. And this is the total 80 to 100 kilos total nitrogen, not just chemical.
So that's 80 units now, Mike, just to transfer it into...
Yeah, the 100 kilos is 80 units, out. So again, you're talking two bags of urea, of straight urea is going to get you somewhere there on that at the moment. And again, depends on if there's slurry gone out on that ground previously, it'll have met some of its P and K requirements. If it hasn't, you're going to have to top that up. So I think, but it's getting enough fertilizer out as soon as possible. Again, getting the conditions so we get a high growth rates and capture some of that April growth rates when it allows. In terms of P, you're talking somewhere between 3 kilos of P per ton of dry matter expected. So if you're talking about a 6-ton crop, 18 kilos of P to grow that. Some of that's going to be met by slurry. If the slurry going out in it. In terms of K, between 20 to 25 kilos of K per ton again. So your K and your nitrogen are probably similar values. I think if you're delaying your fertilizer strategy now and still aiming for an early first cut, we'll talk about that in a second, be careful with going with too much K. So just maybe tailor it back if you're going to be delaying that fertilizer strategy for the next week or 10 days. Hopefully you won't be able to, you won't have to. In terms of heavy covers that are silage ground, outside blocks that typically get slurry, that is currently heavy covers on them that haven't got slurry, be careful with going with slurry on those now. Particularly if it's heavy covers.
I don't think you can, Mike.
I don't think they can either. I think they're going to do too much damage to the sward. You're going to bring it back in again. So I think in that scenario, that heavy covers, you're meeting it all with chemical. The P and K requirements too is all coming from chemical, depending on the P allowance. Obviously, I don't want to piss off any advice.
And that's I suppose it's just a major concern for people if they're depending on that slurry piece to do their P fertilization and they don't have it, then they're just going to have to press on, get a cut, get the slurry out.
I think if you can't get your slurry out and you have no P allowance, I think it's just get your nitrogen out and your K and put out that slurry then after your first cut to grow your second cut crop to get your P allowance. I think we can't compromise timings at this rate. We need to get it in or can't compromise yields either. And look at, again, application as soon as possible. We don't want to delay, particularly, and silage or grazing ground, we can manipulate it somewhat with splitting our application dates depending on ground and where we're grazing. But in terms of silage, we need to get that silage closed off as soon as possible to get an early first cut. And the reason why is if we look at this, and this is the last slide I have, Stuart, but if we look at this and we just look at the different this is first cutting date. So we look at the 25th of May, 12th of June, and 23rd of June for first cut yield. The dark green line is the yield at the first cut, and the lighter green line then, or yellow lines here, is second cut. And the impact of delaying that first cut to bulk up first cut is going to hugely compromise second cut. So the reason I say about getting fertilizer out as soon as possible on silage ground, obviously conditions allowing as well, I think we need to be very conscious of the conditions that are there, but as conditions allowing, try and get our fertilizer cut, our first cut silage in the 3rd week of May. So we can get a good second cut as well. Coming back to James's piece, if we delay first cutting yield here, I've got rid of the slide with quality. If we delay first cutting yield up to the 23rd of June, the quality of that goes to shit completely. And we need good quality silage in the pit for milking cows as well, as we've seen this spring. So try and get an early first cut up to the 20th, 25th of May with silage yields or covers that's on ground at the moment. That should be possible. It's just getting the fertilizer out in time to allow that. So target first cut in mid to late May. Target second cut then, we need to get May growth rate into second cut silage. So waiting until early June to cut it, we're not getting May growth, and that's going to reduce our second cut yields. So again, target it, fertilizer out as soon as conditions allow, and getting a reasonably early cut in mid to late May in that first cut, and then getting a good second cut as well. And we might bulk up our first cut by delaying it, but we're going to reduce overall yield on a 2-cut silage system by doing that. So it's going to compromise total silage coming in. It's not just first cut we need to think about, it's second cut as well. So that's it, Stuart. Sorry, I probably went on a little bit longer, but if there's any questions.
There's a rake of them, Mike. First one is, why should sulphur be included? And I suppose you can deal with that fairly quickly.
Yeah, look, particularly on we're going to say drier ground, not as much of an issue, but on sandier ground, sulphur is vital. It does increase overall dry matter production in the region of at 1 to 1.5 ton cumulative in the year, and it's because there isn't as much sulphur in the air now. So sulphur fertilizer is very important, particularly on sandier free draining soils. And April is the time on for it.
Okay, and I suppose a very pertinent question: what do we do with slurry tanks and dairy washing tanks full? How far in advance of cows can you go in terms of grazing? I don't know. Can you really not?
Look, I think it completely depends on the cover that's there at the moment. I think you're with the rainfall that's coming, and obviously trafficability is a huge issue. But if you're getting a pipe in and you can travel on ground without doing reasonable damage, and you're going on covers with 800 kilos and the heavy rainfall that's coming, and I'm not saying spread fertile or slurry The same issue should be spread around slurry as with fertilizer in terms of predicted rainfall. You should reasonably still get into those paddocks within a 2-week period with reasonably low covers of 700 to 800. You should be able to get back into them in 2 weeks. But be careful with dribble bars or trailing shoes and pipes that the application rate is not going out too heavy. And I think that's one of the biggest problems, particularly with dribble bars. You need to really increase your forward drive and speed to get the application rate correctly. So target it. Don't be going with more than 2,000 gallons of slurry per acre, and you should still get back into them within 2 weeks.
Yeah, okay, and it should be fairly watery as well. I suppose the big question that's coming up there in relation to the ground that's gone too heavy to spread the slurry on it, how much K can you go with?
Yeah, look, I was trying to look. I think that 20 to 25 kilos target. I think it depends on the growing period as well. If you're worried with high K silage, I would ear towards the 20 kilo per ton dry matter. So if you're aiming for a 5 to 6 ton crop, you're still in the region of 80 kilos of K going out per hectare. So you're talking a bag and a half of potash. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. And I suppose, again, a question around 0730 and 1020, if you have an allowance for it, yes, that is the fertilizer.
And look, if you're going with that, and if you have an allowance of thing, the 0730, you're probably talking goes to 2.5 to 3 bags again of meeting the requirements and then topping it up with straight nitrogen afterwards.
Yeah, I suppose the point to make there, and it's kind of to address a couple of questions in one foul swoop there. If you put out 90 units of fertilizer in the form of chemical and organic, we'll say you 45 days effectively is the old rule of thumb in terms of when you can cut. So if we're going in the next couple of days, you're talking you can be cutting anywhere from the 5th or 10th of May onwards. And it's probably important, Michael. I mean, it's probably ironic that we're sitting here talking about the scenario that we're in, and yet we probably need to be looking at cutting silage on farms from the 5th or 6th of May onwards in case.
Look, I think realistically, depending outside of surpluses, I think there's going to be a lot of surpluses cut on the farms this year as soon as dry up, with very little grazing done in April. But I think first cut silages, I think really are going to have to start off this year from the 10th of May onwards, and possibly the 4th, depending on the cover that's on it. But again, that's only really feasible if you get fertilizer out to allow for that 45-day growing period. And look, you might get fertilizer this week, looking at particularly in the south of the country, looking at the predicted rainfall. The north of the country doesn't seem to be getting as much rain at the moment, so I think if it's travelable, try and get it out reasonably soon. But typically, I think we need to be targeting that kind of 10th to the 20th of May first cut target date to get a good second cut in as well.
Any advantage in using 29.14 for damaged ground? It's really the P element that's
it's the P. So
there.
The K won't actually increase the tillering capacity of ryegrass or clover swards. So it's the P element that improves tillering capacity and increases the level of tillering. So Donal talked about tillering in swards. 60% of the tillering happens in March and April, and most of that happens in April. So that P fertilizer now on ground that has been damaged, if you have a P allowance, is vital in April. To try and if it's not gone out already, and most cases it's not, to try and repair some of those paddocks. So the 29.014 plus sulfur is not going to meet that criteria on the P allowance. But again, if you don't have a P allowance, that's fine too.
Okay, and then what about splitting fertilizer application for first cut? Is there any merit in it at this stage?
Yeah, most years that probably happens, but like the first split is probably going out in March and the second split then going out in early April. I think to do that now, you're going to push your cutting date. So I think in a year like this, when we're only talking about realistic, today is the 2nd of April. If you are only closing ground and you can't get onto it today, it's probably going to be closer to the 6th, 7th or 8th or even the 10th of April before it's potentially what the way it's going to do, that you could do it. If you're going to that late, there's no advantage of splitting it. I would say go now. That whole method of splitting it is probably March and April that's happening. March is gone now. If it's not out, go full bugger.
Yeah, okay. I suppose just a one for yourself and maybe for Donal and James to comment on. So 95% of the platform, effectively stuck to the model effectively and on target from a grazing point of view, have no option but to go into the second round in 4 days' time. But we have grass, but underfoot conditions not good, even with 3 hours grazing. Is there anything else that can be done?
Yeah, look, I don't come back in, but I think if your farm cover is very low at this stage, you have no choice but to stick in the second round. You're going to be closing silage ground depending as well. I think you set your stocking whatever it's going to be. You divide your farm up to a 25-day round at this stage, and you fill the hole with feed. And until you come into a situation that growth rates take off and you get yourself out of the hole. But be very careful not to drop your farm cover too low now at this age in that situation. That if you drop your farm cover too low now, it's going to take too long to get out of it. Try and maintain your farm cover, and effectively you're just matching demand and growth with feed at this stage. And James come in the feed side as well, but I think just divide your farm up into a 25-day round, starting whenever you start the second round, and just fill the gap.
I think the key thing is to feed the cow is the big thing that we're trying to push there. James, you've switched back on again.
Yeah, ultimately there, look, I think the first point is make sure we're getting that 10.5, 11 kilos of forage still in. So if we're only getting 4 kilos of grass, we need to be getting 7 kilos of silage in there. And look then at maybe a midday feed of hulls and beet pulp to increase them concentrate feeding levels up to that kind of 8 and 8.5 kilos, Stuart, you know.
Yeah, and Mike, just maybe a quick comment, like, is it if we're forced to go into the start of the second round now in 4 days' time, have we been too good in the plan, if you know what I mean? Did we need to adjust the plan?
Yes, look, it's too late now. I think the time for adjusting the plan is the middle of March to try and push it out with silage, just because the silage in the diet in April, and I'm not going to go on about too much, we can't do much about it, really hampers peak milk production and protein percent in terms of recovery wise. So look, but I think if you're in that situation, there's no point crying over spilled milk. I think you deal with it now and you just divide the farm up. You feed whatever grass you have available while maintaining a farm cover of 550 to 600. I think that's the key point until growth rates take off, or conditions allow growth rates to take off, and you ensure you fill the hole then with supplement. Last
question for you then, Mike, for now anyway. How much sulfur recommended for the year on sandy ground?
Yeah, about 20 to 25 kilos total. And the time for that is probably April, May, June, and probably the first half of July really is the time you need to go out there. So like most of your applications now, and like someone mentioned that product 29-0-14, and they're generally about 4 or 5 sulfur included in them. And if you're going with 3/4 of a bag of that, you're going with that for maybe 5 to 6 applications now with sulfur included in it at somewhere in the region of 3 to 5 units per application or per rotation, sorry.
And I suppose, as I said, if people don't have fertilizer on hand at the moment, if they are buying fertilizer, they should be looking for something that is a high sulfur level because they've missed 2 rotations effectively.
Yeah, and I think that's key at the moment. And talking to any of the fertilizer companies, there's very little fertilizer moving, and it's all, if conditions improve, it's all going to be wanted at the same time, and there is going to be a long lead time. I think even if you can spread today, make the phone call to order it if you haven't done it already.
Yeah, and James, one for you again here now. 40% of her diet as a forage, is it sufficient to keep cow's system right in an effort to conserve what forage is there?
No, 40% is too low. Sure, like the reality is, I kind of mentioned that on a few occasions. We need to be getting that 10.5, 11 kilos of forage in there. So where we're in a situation with like that, we have to look for forage sources. So go to the market, get your hands on some silage. It might not be great quality, but it still needs to go in there in terms of long fiber. I suppose in individual cases like that, you may actually have to look and substitute maybe in with a kilo of straw or something to allow us to do something with regards higher levels of concentrate. But what I would say there is maybe the likes of those cases, have a conversation with your advisor and put a plan in place with regards to that. But 10.5 to 11 kilos of forage, sure, don't dip below it.
Okay, and just a feeding question again, James. Should cows and heifers get different feed rates? Cows getting 5 kgs of concentrate, should heifers that are giving less milk get less concentrate?
I wouldn't start that, to be honest, because it's only starting complications, and if people maybe coming in and doing milkings and stuff, I wouldn't start that. I'd keep the feeding rate constant, and once we're consistent in terms of what we're doing with regards to that, minding the forage and the diet, even where we're going to higher levels, maybe look at your concentrate sources within that in terms of, firstly, you should have said that in terms of probably high energy ingredients maybe is more important than everybody runs for this 18% crude protein, but high energy ingredients and a 16 is probably more important than poor quality ingredients and an 18. But what I would say is look at the sources. Maybe there can be more beet pulp, more hulls included in that concentrate source as well. So you're just getting more fiber into the diet in that way as well. So that's something to maybe look at in the longer term for people that are very tight.
Mike, fertilizer one again, good cover on silage block already, not been able to graze it since the end of last year. Is 80 units actually too much for that?
Yeah, look, I think it depends on your cutting date. If it's a heavy cover on it now, when you plan on cutting it in very early May, 80 units, 100 kilos is probably too much on that. I think try and get an idea in your head at the moment of your planned cutting date. And if it is the 5th of May, 80 units at the moment is probably too high. You need to reduce it back down based on that kind of old figure that Stuart quoted there in a kind of a 2 unit a day scenario. So I think potentially, if you plan on a very early cutting of the 5th to the 10th of May, if you're pushing your cutting date till the 15th, 20th of May, don't really go past that. It's probably not, you'll get a good bulk of reasonable quality, of good quality still. So I think depending on your cutting date, just be careful on that one.
Okay, and then Donal or James, advice around letting out heifers. There's 2 questions. One is letting them out on silage ground at the moment. Ground is dryish, but at this stage, is it better off closing it up? And the second is, can you rely on compensatory growth for heifers now that haven't been left out in the last, would normally be out a month at this stage?
Yep. So Donal, do you want to comment on what is are doing in Ballyhaise with the heifers, and I'll come back in there.
Yeah, so look at we went out in early, well, it's probably around the 10th of March, I'd say, and got round the block. Covers were low because there wasn't much overwinter growth on our heifer block. Some of that silage ground as well. Tried to graze some of the silage ground of it. Weather broke. The lads battled with it probably for 2 weeks, and just before last weekend we pulled them back in again, which isn't ideal, but often happens us. That happens us fairly regular. I suppose the big thing is we've seen in the past the years where that happens and we're back in, and that they're in the shed too close to breeding. It can have a fairly big impact on your fertility results. So I suppose, again, just trying to get back out as early as you possibly can. At this stage, I think I would be trying to avoid, if you have silage ground, I'd be trying to avoid grazing it unless it's like, very, very dry silage, because, if there's a cover on it, I'd be going the route with Mike saying, fertilize it and get a good crop growing now rather than going in and, the chances are that you're going to do a poor job grazing it anyway. So look, it's a difficult situation, and the young stock do tend to be a second thought on most farms. But if you have to bring them back in, you have to bring them back in and feed accordingly if need be. Like,
I think that's the point, Stuart. There's probably a lot of heifers maybe not where they need to be out there. They've been eating average quality silage all winter probably, haven't got out as early maybe as they normally would. So assess in terms of what sort of forage quality you're getting. If you can get them out, if there's grass on outblocks, great. In some cases, the concentrate may need to actually stay in to ensure that we get on well and get a good start in terms of breeding. There's one point there, Stuart, maybe, and Donal, you would have seen this in terms of people, and there's a lot of concern out there because I think cows didn't peak that well last year and performance was back, and we're worried about maybe that happening again. The big one there, Donal, and just comment on that, is where you did get out and put the correct management in play, animal performance in that late turnout group was good. And maybe just if you have a comment on that, because
it was surprising. Look, and I'm not saying there was definitely a lag phase. Like there's no substitute for grazing. When we had the cows housed, performance wasn't as good. Similar to what James is saying, we did attempt over that 4-year period to formulate a diet to get as close as we could to a graze grass diet, which was 7 kilos of an 18% nut, and look at reasonably good quality silage over the period. But protein percentage, milk yield still didn't compare with the grass group. But 2 to 3 weeks, once those cows got out the grass, even though they weren't grazing perfect covers, covers were too high the first part of the spring. When we corrected it, actually, cow performance, there was a lag phase now. There was definitely a lag phase. Like, don't be expecting it just to turn around in the space of a week, because it won't. Like, but 3 weeks in, the groups were back. pretty much on par. And I think that's where we need to focus on now. It's a bit like what Mike said, there's no point in crying over spilt milk. What's happened at this stage is trying to get the ship back on the straight and narrow. And I think that can be done. That can be done even at this late stage.
Oh, good question actually in relation to fertilizer and slurry needs to go out on silage ground. Which first and how much time between applications, Mike?
Slurry first in a week, less than a week, depending. This way you get away with 3 or 4 days. But slurry first and then allow 4 days at this kind of weather.
Okay, and a couple of people asking questions, James, I suppose around breeding of heifers that are indoors still is sexed off the table effectively, and the other question is, should they be left indoors to be bred at this stage?
I think the big point there is ultimately get a weight on heifers, because the big thing that's going to impact in terms of performance is our heifers on target weight. So that's the starting point. Ultimately, as I said, assess what they're on. You would like to get heifers out. And we still have a period of time in terms of, we still have a month. So I'd have no concern in terms of getting heifers out and getting them settled, even it is only a couple of weeks prior to breeding, Stuart. So if the heifers are on target weight, assess what they're eating, get them onto the out blocks. I don't think we should be shying away from the sex semen ultimately. If they're underweight, whether we're talking about,
avoid the sex semen anyway.
Yeah, that's irrespective of the year and the conditions. Heifers need to be on target weight.
Okay, and actually one person here is saying that they're actually on off grazing their heifers at the moment, which is probably a luxury that not a lot of people might have. But in fairness, if it's a solution to a problem, so fair play. So I think we're nearly kind of at the end of it there. One question in there, putting bulling heifers in with milking cows to get grass into the heifers' diet, as can't leave them out full time on off grazing currently with the cows. So a similar thing, but I think is it just complicating us again, lads, in terms of the sheer numbers and stock numbers. It's a challenge. If it's a challenge to get the milking herd out, putting the heifers with them isn't going to be a fantastic idea. And then that seems to be it in terms of questions. I suppose there's one question there in relation to how many units is 40 units in 38.00 plus sulfur. So it's 1.05 bags effectively. So there's 38, it's 38 units. That's what you're spreading. So just to clarify that for people. And actually, Donal, a question for you then, from a fellow Monaghan person. What kind of cover is there on the marginal end as it is possibly closed early because of the bad weather at the back end of last year? So what are you trying to work through there at the moment?
Yeah, look at some of it, some of our marginal ground, which is particular enough in terms of just the situation of the farm. It's along a significant enough river. There's no cover in it. There's because of flooding. There's an area there, probably 15% of the farm that floods, and it was just, even from last summer, there was flooding. It probably came out 7 or 8 times, between last summer and the winter time. So on that portion of the farm, covers are very low. And the plan would be, if there's a dry day, a dry night, let them at it if we can at all, even at a low cover, and to try and just wake it up and get it going. The other parts of the farm, marginal, there's some fairly heavy coverage. Well, up on 1,500. That's sort of a mark. We don't have that much above that at the minute. And we were having the conversation today, in 10 days' time, if the thing hasn't improved, what are we going to do? And more than likely, we'll have to just grin and bear it, try and graze it, do a pretty poor job, and move on and try and correct it in the next rotation. Like, there's no magic solution to it. That's basically, it's looking like that's possibly where we're going to be at. It's just going to be try and get some of the grass off it, Stuart. Yeah, so it's not ideal, but we'll do what we can.
Okay, and Mike, I think we might finish with you on this one. Now, this was specifically targeted at silage ground, but I think it's probably true of all ground, grazing ground. So we're advocating that people spread fertilizer as soon as they can. But is it pointless spreading if ground is saturated, and given that the forecast is poor for the next 5 days, will it get leached?
Yeah, so if ground is saturated and waterlogged at the moment, there is no advantage financially, grass growth point of view, or more so environmentally in spreading fertilizer on waterlogged ground. So I think the key thing, if you're looking at fertilizer, and sorry, it's a different one because of full tanks and that, but if you have the luxury of not, but if ground is waterlogged, avoid spreading fertilizer because you are going to increase loss to water. Number two, ensure that soil temperatures are 6 degrees and rising, not much of an issue at the moment. So I think what we normally talk about in terms of when do we go with fertilizer in February, we now need to look at now in April as well because of the predicted rainfall and also waterlogged conditions. So ground that is waterlogged, don't spread it on it. And if there is exceptionally heavy rainfall promised in the following 24 to 36 hours, after you plan on going with it, don't go with it either. So wait, ideally 36 to 48 hours with no rainfall and ground that is not waterlogged. I think they're the two criteria that we need to look at the moment in terms of when and if we go with fertilizer or slurry.
Yeah, okay. So look, we're after going well over the time we kind of had planned to be on for an hour, and we're facing the hour and a half now at this stage, and loads of questions flying in there. So the thanks very much to everyone for contributing, and with big numbers on there. So obviously we've really hit a nerve. You want to say something there, Mike?
Yeah, just one question. I saw a question there from a Tom. Will I roll silage ground?
Yeah.
At this stage, I wouldn't with the wet weather. I don't like rollers anyway. And okay, unless it was grazed and badly damaged, a roller is going to do more damage this year than any other year in terms of compaction and reducing yield. So unless it's a quarry and full of stones, don't roll it.
Yeah. So yeah, just I suppose huge interest obviously this evening because of the circumstances that are affecting people across the country. We'll keep this under review obviously, and if hopefully the weather forecast will look somewhat better this day week as opposed to what it currently looks like, and things will turn, and that's probably the thing that people have to hang on to. While I kind of indicated earlier that hope isn't a strategy, which is it's probably the hope being a strategy that has got us to maybe being on the cusp of trouble in some cases. We have to put a plan in place like Donal has outlined there for the next week and reappraise that situation again in a week's time on the basis of better information at that point in time. So look, contact your own advisors and so forth. Make sure you attend your discussion groups because you'll find out that you're not the only one in that scenario, obviously, and you can get some good solutions to come from them. Mike, you're looking to come in again, are you?
Yeah, and just for anyone again in that situation that's facing into issues, there's a series of spring grass walks that are kicking off tomorrow that will deal with a lot of the issues that was currently talked about now, and particularly focused towards regions. We'll have the weather data and grass data for individual regions that the walks are on. So there's going to be 12 of those walks kicking off from tomorrow in Cork, and they're going to be all over the country. So just keep an eye out too for one that may be close to you that you possibly could attend and hopefully get something else from them.
And Mike, just one final one again on the fertilizer. What's heavy rainfall? Is it a yellow warning or like
yeah, so
it is
heavy
a common
rainfall
question.
is anything, I think it's 10 to 12 mil within a 24-hour period.
Okay, so we have one or two of those days coming at us.
Yeah. So it's 10 to 12 mil, which may not fall into a yellow. I don't know what a category for a yellow warning is, but 10 to 12 mil in a 24 to 36 hour period.
Okay, so look, for my third attempt to close it now at this stage, thanks everyone for joining in, and thanks to the lads for sharing their information and knowledge with us. We wish you all well in the short term, and as we said, you have to go and plan out for the coming week. We acknowledge the conditions, very much acknowledge the conditions that people are dealing with, but try to, where possible, get cows out because it's positive from the cow's point of view, from the energy intake piece, and where they're not able to get out, feed the living daylights out of them in the short term until you can get out, and just be looking to get out at every opportunity. And as I said, we'll keep the situation under review over the next couple of days, and we will come back again where appropriate. And obviously, as I said, the advisors are available to consult with and attend your discussion groups because we're covering these at group meetings at the moment as well. So thank you for joining in, and we wish you well for the coming couple of weeks. Thank you. Thanks, lads.